Во тема на денот, како што најавив, разговарам со амбасадорот на Европската унија во земјава, Дејвид Гир. Welcome, good evening, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Lavica. It's a pleasure, as always, to join the program.
We've been living for a longer period of time in a society where everybody is divided on all topics and are seeing events with diametrically different diopters. That was also reflected on the recent statements that we have received from the summit in Bled and a speech that Macron had in Paris. For some, the most important, the key topic was the set date for EU enlargement that the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, kind of set during this event in Bled. For the others, the most important topic was what Macron said and whether there will be a Europe in different speeds after what he announced there. So what do you think we actually received? Some encouragement or a cold shower?
Well, I think you received a very strong encouragement. The speech by the President of the European Council, so that brings together the 27 member states. He's the president of that, speaking in his own capacity, but that speech was really a very important moment. He set out a very ambitious vision for enlargement of the European Union. He set it in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, explaining why now there is particular momentum, particular intensity on the debate on enlargement, and why it is so important for the European Union and for the candidate countries that they join. Not just, it's important in itself, prosperity, but also the imperative in terms of stability, security, and democratic values. He was as an outstanding speech, very practical, very focused. I encourage your readers to pick it up and read it to see what he actually said, but he was very, I think, practical. It wasn't an airy, abstract speech. He made it clear that the process is one of reforms. It will be a merit-based process. He was also clear that that's not an easy task for the countries concerned. At the same time, he said there's homework for the European Union to do. We have to prepare for enlargement. What are the implications of growing from 27 to more than 30, maybe 37 member states at some point? So, and at the same time, he also said that this is an appeal to the hearts and minds, and this needs to be understood by the general public. So a very serious, I would say, historic and political speech, not at all a cold shower. And a speech, I think, which was reflected also by remarks from Commissioner Vahey very shortly afterwards about the urgency, the need to move forward. Yes, the President mentioned a date of 2030. And President Macron, he himself has regularly underlined the importance of enlargement from a prosperity, security, and stability perspective. So what is always surprising to me and baffling, if you like, is how commentators somehow manage to turn this very positive opportunity that's being presented into something opposite, as if black becomes white suddenly or white becomes black. It's an opportunity. It's a clear message to the candidate countries. We want you in. We want this country, North Macedonia, in the European Union. Here is an opportunity, and we're planning for it.
You said it yourself, it's an ambitious goal. Is it realistic one? Because the 2030 date as a year of enlargement, because you know how many reforms our country needs to undertake. And we have also seen how Serbia and Montenegro are progressing or not progressing. Why should we believe it will be different for us?
I say it's ambitious, because I don't want to understate the challenges of carrying out reform. What needs to be done is indeed to implement comprehensive reforms affecting most areas of life. So from, of course, the areas that we know, like the rule of law, corruption, but also the economy, the environment, building up the skills, the labor force, so that this country, when it joins the European Union, it can really benefit from the opportunities that are there, and also that it's sufficiently resilient to be able to survive in what is a very competitive environment. But I think there are two issues which are going to be crucial, which are going to make the difference as to when this country joins. And that is, first of all, and something I've said before, In order to carry out this ambitious program of reforms, the political parties need to come together and they need to agree that the EU-related reforms are the top priority and that they will put that in advance of other priorities, that it will be, if you like, a national project. They don't need to form a coalition. It's perfectly healthy to have opposition and government, but they do need to agree this is the main focus. And this is how Croatia proceeded in difficult years in managing to move forward on the agenda. And the second thing, I think, is again related to this idea of a national project, is that this has to be, this ambition, this determination to move forward on reforms needs to cut across all of the institutions, so government, parliament, judiciary, police, everything that you have, plus also business, civil society and citizens. It really has to be a national project. With that, yes, it's achievable, but it's really a path of implementing reforms. And after all, reforms which I think citizens, if you follow any news or any of the blogs, you see them citizens really asking for.
We have mentioned at the beginning the speech of the French President Macron, who said that EU needs to reform itself, and he discussed the idea of Europe at different speeds. Is there such an idea that is being discussed within the European Union, and what does it mean? Because also this was a topic that was interpreted differently. For example, the government said that Macron was referring to a merit-based system of enlargement, and other commentators said that actually this means different stages, different levels of membership in the European Union. Is there such an idea at the EU?
First of all, I think it's worth commenting that people, it surprises me that people are shocked when there are discussions about the future shape of the EU, about the enlargement process, what's the best way forward. I would be shocked if they weren't having those discussions, because that would suggest that they're not actually serious about enlargement. So all of the debates that you see from different actors about enlargement, I think, are showing that we're recognizing that this is really now a serious process. There is a real prospect now of moving forward, and therefore we need to prepare to make sure that the EU is sufficiently resilient and effective, and also that the benefits that come from enlargement can be shared. So I think it's a normal process of discussion. No one, I think, is saying that there should not be full membership. Countries have applied for full membership of the European Union, and that's what we're all looking at. But of course, there is a debate about a number of issues. For example, the European Commission has raised the question, after discussions with governments here in the Western Balkans, about how can we get some of the benefits of enlargement earlier on, rather than waiting until the very end of the process. Maybe, for example, access to the internal market. And so that's, again, an example of how to accelerate integration. And the Commission is working on ideas on that, which it will present in the autumn to the member states and to the partners concerned. So I see there's a lot of a lot of ideas about how to move forward. But the goal is membership, full membership for each of the candidate countries, provided they also do the homework, which is the reforms.
Yes, I think that the fear here was not that the EU will discuss different ideas, but that this will take much longer time than expected, and that it actually is opposite to the idea of 2030 as a date.
You're quite right, because Charles, this is a worry, and this is a point that Charles Michel, President of the European Council, mentioned in his speech specifically. He said that people seem to misinterpret this discussion about reforms. It's not about having a discussion about reforms, and then when finally the EU has decided how it's reformed, then we turn to the enlargement. No. They go hand in hand. It's a preparedness, seriousness, credibility of the EU to make sure that this process is a real success and that the EU is even more of a success with you in it.
Our path at the moment is primarily dependent on whether we have the constitutional changes or not. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes, but is there still any hope that this setting in the parliament, the setting of powers in parliament, can adopt such constitutional changes?
I mean, it's always open to parliament to make this decision. And it's for every single parliamentarian to decide on the basis of his or her understanding of the national interest what the best way to move forward is. And there is a vigorous public debate on this issue, which is a good thing. And now we have specific proposals, so it's possible to focus on those proposals rather than other abstract ideas. From our side, we are contributing to that public debate. We recognize this as a sovereign decision for this country to make, but I think we want to make a couple of points which we consider would help in looking at this issue. And the first, of course, is indeed we now have the text of the proposals. To our understanding, these build on the country's already good record on interethnic relations and would not undermine the fundamental interest of the country. And the second takes us back to that speech from Bled made by President Michel. It talks about, it's a recognition that at the moment we are living through an extraordinary time. We have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, unjustified and unprovoked, which has added an intensity, as I say, to the understanding of the need to move forward on enlargement. That enlargement is not just prosperity, as I say. That's a big thing already, prosperity, but it's also stability, security, and of course, democratic values. And that there is a strategic interest, both for the European Union and for the candidate countries, to join rapidly based on reforms. So again, these constitutional changes, each MP will have to decide what he or she is going to do. But I think it's important to have that bigger picture in mind. At the moment, there is considerable momentum. And as you know very well, in politics and in international relations, momentum is not something that one should miss. On the contrary, I think it's important to seize the opportunity in order to move forward decisively.
Are there any discussions with the opposition? And is the EU considering to implement some of its conditions when it comes to supporting the constitutional changes? Delayed implementation, some kind of guarantees about the identity and opening of other questions in the future with Bulgaria, maybe some measures taken by Sofia when it comes to the Macedonian minority. Is there any discussion like that, and are there any possibilities like this on the table?
I think you're very much aware of the number of ministers and partners that have been to Skopje, that have met with government, but also with the opposition, to explain very much what I've been saying today, to explain the broader context, also to give reassurance. The Macedonian language is secure, it's recognized in the negotiating framework, to give reassurance about identity, about culture, about history. You do not lose your identity on the way to the European Union, and really to explain how we see it in the European Union. And I'm sure these discussions will, of course, continue in an open way, clearly setting out why adopting the constitutional changes will allow the country to move forward now to the next step, which is holding of intergovernmental conference and then going in depth into the negotiations around a number of key issues.
Yeah, so nothing specific at the moment that could be referred to as the EU implementing something that is set as a condition by the opposition party in terms of, let's say, some kind of formal guarantee, or
we're not renegotiating the agreement that was reached in July 2022. That is the agreement. We are standing by that agreement. We're making sure it's going to be implemented, and we're trying to reassure that this process of enlargement will be merit-based and will not will not be a source of concern for the future identity, the identity of the country, its language, its culture, its history.
Does this momentum, as you say, has a deadline? Because we see that now, at the moment, the parliament doesn't have the majority. One option is to have elections and maybe afterwards to decide on this matter. But is there a deadline that is pressing the parliament to do this quickly when we see that it's probably impossible at this very moment?
That's for parliament. Possibilities is for parliament to determine. It's for politicians to try and work out how to move forward. We always say politics is the art of the possible. So I don't want to, exclude any possibility of moving forward. But what I would say is the screening process itself which is very important and which is only possible because we opened accession negotiations, should come to an end sometime towards the end of the year. That means then, if the constitutional changes have not been made, it's not possible to move to the next step, which is this big meeting, this intergovernmental conference, and then going into the deeper negotiations on critical areas like the rule of law, good governance, rule of law, anti-corruption, etc. So I think there is an urgency to maintain momentum in the discussions, in the negotiations. And I think the broader political context means that there is an urgency to move forward now and not to postpone to sometime in the future after elections or whenever. All of this is a sovereign choice for the country. I'm not telling the country what to do, but I'm giving my best advice, which is when there is momentum, seize it.
Yes. All internal efforts seem to be focused on adopting the constitutional changes. We don't see some action when it comes to reforms and really changing the country in a EU manner. The screening report for the first cluster was already delivered, and it gave some guidance in the areas of democratic institutions, rule of law, fight against corruption, and judiciary. Do you think something is being done in those areas? We have discussed this in the past. Do you think that the message was delivered and that things start to move in the right direction?
I'm glad you asked the question, because very often when I'm interviewed, an interview will just focus on the constitutional changes and not actually deal with the big elephant in the room, which is actually reforms. And that is the hardest thing, and the thing that's going to really change people's lives and impact on it in numerous ways. Yes, some reforms have been done, and the screening report shows that. And in some areas, this country is well advanced, for example, on the economy, in some specific areas such as statistics, and some of the institutions, they show that they're well advanced, even more advanced than some other candidate countries. But there are also big gaps, which the screening report shows, areas where urgent action is needed. You mentioned one, of course, the rule of law, where there needs to be much more ambition in terms of reforms. We have followed very closely what has been achieved so far, but much more is needed. And in the past period, we've expressed great concern about some of the developments, negative developments in this area, not least as regards the Judicial Council, which is why we deployed an expert mission, a so-called peer review, to come to the Judicial Council, to come to this country and try and make recommendations for how to move forward. But it's very clear, without reforms, without energy on reforms, the country cannot move forward.
Well, while the EU expects decisive action against organized crime and corruption, the government sent a new proposal with a European flag to change the criminal code and to lower the sentences on corruption. Is this part of the EU agenda?
Well, this proposal was on the website of the Parliament only yesterday evening.
Yes.
So as usual, what we do, we would take the proposal, look at it in detail, analyze it with our colleagues in Brussels, and then consider whether or not, indeed, it is advancing the country in terms of norms and standards. We, as you can imagine, haven't completed that process yet, so I can't comment more on that, other than to say, to remind that the general rule for when you EU flag legislation is that it should be legislation which is basically aligning domestic law with the EU norms and standards. After all, the EU flag system, which is a kind of shortens discussion in Parliament, exists because there is so much legislation to adopt over time that there needs to be mechanisms to shorten and to ensure that the country can move quickly on those ones. That doesn't mean you should shortcut on important discussions or because there are procedural difficulties. But as I say, we've just got the proposal and we're looking at it in depth.
Yes, and we have seen that, for example, it was used for Bechtel and Enka, which is something that you already had a reaction. Yes, yeah. You already commented on that. Well, Macedonia is currently rocked by a scandal at the oncology clinic. In your opinion, do you think that the institutions have the capacity to deal with such complicated but also very sensitive matter such as this case?
And of course, it's a hugely sensitive case. And I can only imagine the feelings of the families and patients as well when they read all of this in the news. Of course, at the moment, this is being investigated. It's subject to police investigation, to the prosecutor. So I can't comment on that specific case. But what I would say is that we have invested over many years in strengthening the police, strengthening the capacities of the prosecution and of the judges. So the capacity exists here to do the job, which means to determine what happened, what the facts are, and determine accountability for what went wrong, even criminal accountability. And for that, they have the means to do it. That means that politics, that politicians, that business interests need to keep their hands off, and they need to allow the professionals to do the job. That's what every citizen of this country is entitled to expect, and that's what we in the European Union expect of a candidate country.
Ambassador Gir, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.